My mother was a courtesan who used her own hard-earned money to support my father's studies for the imperial exam. 5 years later, my father passed the exam and the emperor granted him a marriage to a princess. However, he refused the marriage with his life at the golden throne and married my mother with a grand procession. The princess was displeased. 3 days later, my mother was assaulted and died in an alley. Half a year later, the princess fulfilled her wish and married my father. She did not know that this was the beginning of her misfortune. Ding! RoyalStory reminds you to click the subscribe button in the bottom right corner to read the complete novel. The day my mother died was my 5th birthday. Early that morning, my father took me out, bought many fruits and cakes on the street, and picked out a beautiful hairpin for my mother. He said my mother had a difficult labor giving birth to me, almost losing her life, and asked me to give her this hairpin that night. I happily agreed, knowing the lotus flower dangling from it was mother's favorite, and she would surely be delighted. Father then asked me many questions about whether I had heard any rumors at school and whether anyone spoke ill of my mother. When I nodded, he anxiously asked me, "Does your mother treat you well?" "Mother treats me well, I like her," I replied. Father's tense face relaxed a lot, and he softly told me, "Your mother is a woman of bitter fate, but she is the purest person in this world. You must always listen to her and be filial to her." I was just about to agree when a servant stumbled in, panic in his eyes. "Madam. Madam is dead in the alley." Father didn't care about me and almost crawled forward, falling and injuring his face and hands, getting back up and running. I cried, following him and calling for my father, but he didn't look back. Father pushed through the crowd at the alley entrance. He was always polite and had never raised his voice, but now he lost all decorum, shouting, "Get away! Get away! Don't look! Don't!" He screamed heartbreakingly, tearing his outer robe to cover mother, holding her helplessly and running towards the house. He couldn't stop sobbing, like a stray dog with no home after a family disaster. Father didn't let me see mother's body. He locked himself and mother up together, and they said father had gone mad. 5 days later, he came out, emaciated, and prepared mother's funeral methodically. Father had lost much weight but looked even more handsome. On the day of the funeral, the princess, extravagantly dressed and beautiful, came to our house. She was stunning, like the morning glow, the first beauty of the capital. She was of noble birth, with inherent arrogance in her every word and action, but she restrained herself upon seeing my father, her demeanor shifting to that of a bashful maiden. Father dealt with her flawlessly, occasionally saying a few polite words, which made the princess smile incessantly. That night, after sending off the princess, father gripped my shoulders, knelt down, and looked up at me. "Did you see the third princess's face clearly?" I nodded. I was very young then, but it was the first time I understood hatred. Father's expression didn't change. "In the future, father will peel off that face to make a drumhead for your rattle. Do you want it?" I shook my head and smiled sweetly. "No need, father. I can make it myself." Father was satisfied and smiled. After mother's funeral, father returned to his position at the Hanlon Academy. The same official red robe always looked more majestic on him than on others. Every day when father came home, he would carry the scent of the third princess's garments. Half a year later, the princess was pregnant, shocking the court, but father remained calm, teaching me to read and write as usual. A woman cannot hide her pregnancy forever. Eventually, it is noticed. When rumors spread, it would be a scandal across the city. The third princess's reputation for improper conduct before marriage spread inside and outside the palace, even reaching the censorate. One night, someone dressed as a palace maid knocked on the top scholar's mansion door. In the dead of night, I heard a woman sobbing, "My reputation is ruined, and you still won't ask the emperor to marry me. Do you want me to die, Richard? Abort this child, and I will marry you. You don't want to wear wedding clothes with a big belly, do you? Children will come again, but a wedding is only once." "I'm scared." Father replied, "What are you afraid of? Do you want the emperor to know it was me? If he knows, what about my career? Your Highness, our fates are linked. My parents are both dead. Whether I have an official position or not, I'm doing this to secure your future. But how do I tell the emperor? The third princess cried, "He will beat me to death." Father's voice was like a lure, "Abort this child and tell the emperor it belongs to a servant in your palace. If you then insist on marrying me, the emperor, though angry, will agree and even promote me as compensation. If I rise in rank, won't you also benefit?" Father's sweet words quickly soothed the third princess. Abortion harms the body, and the next day, the princess's maid came crying, saying the princess was bleeding non-stop after taking the medicine and begged father to take a look. Father dismissed the maid, saying too many eyes were watching. 5 days later, the emperor summoned father and forcibly arranged a marriage, even promoting father. Outside, they all said father picked up a huge broken shoe. But I knew this rumor was spread by father. The third princess had once sent a broken shoe to my mother during my parents' wedding, mocking her past as a courtesan, calling her a cheap woman unworthy of being the top scholar's wife. Father wanted her to suffer the same humiliation she had once inflicted on my mother. On father's wedding day, the preparations were simple, and the princess's wedding clothes were borrowed overnight from the eldest princess. She had originally aimed for the wedding dress mother wore, which father had commissioned a year to make, working to transcribe books for money while studying, just to surprise mother after his success. The pearls on mother's wedding dress were harvested by father himself, diving with pearl divers. When the princess expressed her desire for mother's wedding dress, father's expression changed. He smirked, "Does your highness see yourself as a courtesan?" The third princess thought father was teasing and flirtatiously pushed him, "I'm a princess, not a cheap woman like her." Father's eyes grew colder, indeed, incomparable. The princess abandoned the idea of wearing my mother's wedding dress. Perhaps she finally remembered how she once spat on seeing my mother, cursing, "Someone as lowly as you is not worthy of wearing the same color as me." She had ordered people to strip mother's clothes off, and if father hadn't arrived in time, mother would have died of shame and anger that day. During the wedding, father placed my mother's tablet in the center, causing the third princess to turn red with anger. Father covered his head and weakly said, "I dream of Cheryl every day, it makes me uneasy. Moreover, you are my second wife. Paying respects to her means nothing, just do it for me." The third princess's eyes showed a hint of struggle. It's fine if she were from a respectable family, but she was lowly born. I am a princess. How could she be worthy of my respects? Father, with his dark hair and red lips, gradually lowered his slender eyes, a faint ring of red appearing at the corners, a rare beauty indeed. The princess was stunned by father's sorrowful gaze. The hall went silent, and I could even hear her swallowing. Father's slender fingers lingered at his lean waist, a reddish silken sash wrapped around his jade-like fingers, making his already fair skin even more striking. He spoke self-deprecatingly, "I thought you truly liked me, admired me, wanted to spend a lifetime with me. Apparently, it's not the case. Your Highness merely sees me as dispensable, doesn't care about my life or death." The wandering Taoist said Cheryl harbors resentment, which is why she clings to me and refuses to reincarnate. He sighed softly and tugged at the red sash around his waist. His strong waist was immediately covered by the loosened wedding robe. Father took off the wedding robe and threw it on the ground, lips pursed. "If you don't want to pay your respects to her, then forget about this marriage. I will die sooner or later anyway. If that's the case, let Cheryl take me to the underworld. Why make you suffer as a widow?" The princess hurriedly picked up his wedding robe and pulled it back onto him, choking. "Richard, how can you say such a thing? It's heart-wrenching. How could I not care about your life and death? If so, I'll pay my respects. Put it on, don't be angry." Only then did father put on the wedding robe and bow to her during the ceremony, later forcing the princess to serve tea to my mother's tablet, both firmly and softly, before sending her back to her room. That night, father put a sleeping pill into the princess's postpartum medicine and held me outside the ancestral hall where my mother's tablet was placed, sitting for the whole night. I asked father why he didn't go inside. Father stroked my head, and under the moonlight, his face was as white as a ghost's, but his eyes were moist. He smiled bitterly at me, "Sherry dear, go light an incense for your mother on behalf of father." Father is scared. Confused, I asked him, "What is father afraid of?" "Mother loves me and you so much. Even if she became a ghost, she would protect us." I pulled father's hand towards the ancestral hall. Father, don't be afraid of mother. Mother loves father. She won't harm you. Father trembled, falling to the ground, crying suppressedly at the threshold of the hall. His slender shoulders made arches in the red wedding robe, resembling a dying crane or a broken-necked swan, painfully moaning on the ground. I have no face to see your mother again. The next morning, the princess asked where father's wedding robe had gone, as she couldn't see it. Father quietly had his meal and responded indifferently. I got up in the middle of the night and accidentally fell, so it got dirty. I threw it away. I have a cleanliness habit, as you know. Though somewhat unsatisfied, the third princess did not inquire further. The wedding robe was torn and burned by father the previous night. In the blazing firelight, father, in his white clothes, looked even more elegant. The bright firelight revealed his face, and I saw his twisted, disgusted eyes, like a snarling dog ready to snap at the enemy's vulnerable neck. The princess sighed. It's a pity my father thought I was a disgrace, so this wedding was hastily arranged. I only have this one chance in a lifetime, Richard. Her gaze at father was filled with an unmistakable implication. Father was just a poor scholar with no money to his name when he married mother. He survived by gathering herbs on the mountain and copying books for noblemen. Mother was a famous courtesan in Flower House in Canal County, courted by many noble sons who would spend a fortune just for a glance from her. But she didn't want the riches and glory of high-born men, she wanted genuine love. She gave all her savings to father, asking him to buy her freedom. Mother was actually very scared, fearing that father would take the money and run, leaving her behind. She was gambling, betting on whether father's feelings for her were real. Mother's sister also gave all her money to her beloved to buy her freedom, but he ran away with the money, and mother's sister was heartbroken and drowned herself in the lake. Mother was luckier than her sister, she won her bet. Father had nothing but a belly full of useless knowledge and a sincere heart. The white silk mother had prepared for her own death was not used. Instead, father cut it into several pieces and used it to paint mother's face on each segment. Mother came alive under his brush, looking like a fairy from heaven. After freeing mother, they simply bowed to heaven and earth to marry, using nature as their witness. Mother cared about her status and didn't want people to come. She feared the shame. Although she didn't say it, father understood. Later, father achieved high ranks in the imperial exams and received an official salary. He saved money to give mother a dignified wedding and bow to heaven and earth again. He knew that even though mother didn't say it, she wanted it too. Father had not originally intended for this wedding to be a grand affair, fearing more than anyone else that people would gossip about mother. But then a princess dug up mother's past as a courtesan and spread it everywhere, almost causing father to lose his position. Mother became the laughingstock of the whole capital. Everyone said mother was cheap and shameless, a worthless woman who dared to dream of becoming an official's wife, forgetting her lowly origins. The third princess even led her group of close friends and servants to say filthy things outside our residence, intending for mother to hear. Father's grand wedding was his way of telling mother, and everyone in this capital who watched and sneered, that the woman they called cheap and worthless was the love of his life, the best person he knew. He spent all his savings to hold another wedding for mother in the midst of their slander. The wedding clothes were the finest, and even the paired mandarin duck's embroidered quilt was drawn by father himself. The giant pearls on her phoenix crown were strung together by father's own hands. No one expected father's response, and the third princess was so furious she locked herself indoors. Those who mocked mother fell silent, only to begin cursing father more viciously, saying he was blinded by lust. They despised mother while envying her at the same time. When the third princess brought up the wedding now, it was only to hint that father should hold another grand wedding for her too. She wanted her wedding to be even more extravagant than mother's. But she miscalculated, father would never agree to that. Her eager gaze fell on father's face. He set down his chopsticks, smiling gently. Was it impressive? The smile on the princess's lips froze. Father picked up the handkerchief on the table and gently wiped the princess's lips, his tone light and airy. My dear princess, everyone knows you lost your virtue before marriage. People outside call you a shameless slut. Holding another wedding would just make them laugh at you again, wouldn't it? The princess's eyes reddened, and tears began to spill over. Father clicked his tongue lightly, with a hint of a smile in his eyes. Why cry? I like shameless sluts like you. Your skills in bed are far better than those lowly brothel prostitutes. Men love it, you should be proud. The princess threw herself into his arms, sobbing, You're talking nonsense. Father's lips twitched awkwardly before relaxing into a patient smile. All right, I know you're upset. But wasn't it you who had your maid drug me? Why cry now? When you have a child, I'll hold a grand ceremony for you then. With you basking in glory, no one will dare to speak against you. The princess sat up, sniffling, touching her belly with a fresh wave of grievance. The royal doctor said I lost a boy. You didn't even come to see me that day, I nearly died from the pain. Father's voice remained serene, soothing her with a bright smile. Wasn't I doing it for your sake? The emperor has now given me a position in the Ministry of War. Hurry and give me another son, and I will secure a title for him. In the future, everything will be his. The princess was happy again, instructing the doctor to carefully examine and prescribe medicine. She wanted to conceive as soon as possible. She took me to her room when father wasn't around, using her long nails to pinch my eyelids and pull out my lashes. She said my eyes looked just like mother's, saying I was fated to become a whore like her. Sooner or later, she would gouge them out and feed them to the dogs. It hurt so much, but I didn't cry. I stood quietly before her, enduring her abuse, forcefully holding back the tears. I won't cry in front of her. One day, I'll make her cry in front of me, weeping in agony, at least more than I do. There was one day I couldn't bear it anymore. She used a candle to sear my eyes. The pain was unbearable, and though I tried hard to endure it, tears streamed down my face. I hated myself for that. How could I cry in front of her? Later, I smelled blood and felt a bit happier. Blood was much better than tears. Whenever I couldn't stand her abuse, I would tell myself over and over, remember this pain. Only by remembering the pain, won't the hatred of her killing my mother fade with time. I feared forgetting the coldness, the pain that made me retch to the point of losing my breath. I hated my memory. My mother was so good to me, but I was gradually forgetting her face. I couldn't forget. I would fight the natural fading of memory as I grew older. I must always remember my mother's kindness and appearance. And the hatred from that day. Every time the princess finished tormenting me, I would stay alone in my room, studying while waiting for my wounds to heal. I didn't tell my father. Father had his path for revenge, and I had mine. I didn't want to rely on anyone. Father was busy. He spent less time at home, and whenever he came back, he brought a bunch of people to the study to discuss affairs. Seasons passed, and I watched as the people father brought home changed, from minor officials to high-ranking ones, and later, even infamous officials of the East Depot and the Regent, who held power over the empire. The color of father's robes changed too, and he became more adept at currying favor, yet his gaze grew colder and his back thinner. My once silent and bashful father, who used to get nervous and shy around my mother, had unknowingly become skilled in navigating the dark world of officialdom. If my mother were still alive, she would secretly shed tears out of pity. She was someone who would worry for days over even the smallest bump or bruise on father. Knowing how gaunt he was now, she probably couldn't sleep well. For years later, the princess became pregnant again. She was overjoyed, proudly returning to the palace in a luxurious carriage and staying until nightfall. When she came back, the carriage was filled with gold and silver treasures. She strutted in like a peacock, saw me studying, and kicked me in the chest. She grabbed me with a hateful grip, pinching my face and lifting it. Her face was cold, and she tightened her grip as if she wanted to strangle me. You look just like your wretched mother, equally irritating. Unlike her usual slow, deliberate torment, with this new child, she became more ruthless. Wendy, the maid beside her, intervened. Your Highness, her mother hindered you and the prince consort from being together. She died too easily back then. Now, keep this little wretch's life for now and torment her slowly, making her atone for her mother's sins. The princess loosened her grip a bit. Wendy whispered in her ear, You're just pregnant. The prince consort has just returned from disaster relief and is about to be promoted. This wretch's life is expendable, but she cannot affect your standing with the prince consort. Once you give birth to a son, the prince consort will have an heir, and he will naturally despise this wretch. The princess smiled and threw me to the ground. I'll let you live for a few more days. We'll settle scores later. She carefully touched her belly, a shy, satisfied smile on her face, and left grandly. She didn't know that the child she carried wasn't my father's. Father loathed her to the point that he'd never touch her. On those nights, the mansion was filled with seductive fragrances, and it was unclear if it was beggars or prisoners entering her bed. Father secretly found the ruffians who defiled and murdered my mother. They knelt before him, begging for mercy. They told him the princess had said the woman they were to violate was a lowly prostitute they could play with as they wished. Father was stunned, sitting aside in a daze. He didn't get angry but instead laughed unusually after coming to his senses, muttering lowly until he ran out of strength. Then, he covered his head, fell to his knees, gasping painfully, his face covered in tears. The next day, in the room beside my mother's ancestral hall, my father skinned 5 people and made beautiful lanterns out of their skins right in front of me. When he started with the first person, it was slow and intermittent. Father's hands were steady and his gaze terrifyingly sharp, the spurting blood splashing onto his face. He was truly frightening, like a vengeful ghost from hell. But when he looked at me, his eyes held a smile. They were right, Father had gone mad. He waved at me and asked with a smile if I was scared. I shook my head and said I wasn't. I was my father's child, how could I be scared? Father had gone mad, how could I be a normal person? That night, 5 monstrous lanterns hung from the beams in my mother's ancestral hall. I knew this was just the beginning. Father was truly mad, there was no turning back for him. I found some ointment to apply to my bleeding skin, then picked up the strategies of the warring states from the floor and continued studying. Father didn't want me to learn music, chess, calligraphy, or embroidery, but instead hired the best tutors to teach me the 4 books and 5 classics, as well as the 6 arts of a gentleman. I understood Father's intentions and knew what he wanted to do, I couldn't hold him back. It's truly unfortunate that, as my mother's daughter, I inherited none of her kindness and softness. Instead, I was as ruthless as Father. That night, the princess hosted a grand banquet at the manor, and Father returned very late. The princess happily shared her news of pregnancy with Father. Richard, it's been over 4 months, and the imperial doctor says there's an 80 to 90% chance it's a boy. Father's face showed a mysterious smile. He was very thin, making his face appear even more angular. Even when he smiled sarcastically, it was enough to captivate people. Is that so? Father raised his cup to her and said with a smile, "Congratulations." As he smiled, he broke into hearty laughter, drinking several cups in a row. The princess's cheeks turned red and she was extremely happy. Are you that happy? Father sneered, naturally. He had drunk a lot, and his body was a bit unsteady. He held the princess's face with his fingers, smiling as he asked, "Your Highness, you're only 20 years old, why do you look so much older?" The smile froze on the princess's face. She cared deeply about her beautiful face, and Father's words struck her like lightning. "Richard, I've gotten old?" Her voice trembled and she was nearly in tears. Father let go of her face and instead grabbed Wendy's hand, slurring in his drunkenness, "How come I didn't know your Highness had such a fresh and lovely maidservant?" After speaking, Father collapsed onto the table and fell asleep. The princess angrily slapped Wendy in the face. Wendy knelt and kept kowtowing, her head bleeding as she repeatedly pleaded for mercy. The princess ordered someone to bring a bronze mirror. The flesh on her cheeks trembled as she stared intently at her reflection, then turned to Wendy's face, glaring at it. In a chilling voice, she asked those beside her, "Am I more beautiful, or is this wretch more beautiful?" Everyone around knelt down at once. "Of course your Highness is more beautiful." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes, making her face appear twisted and malicious. "Since the prince consort praised you for being fresh and lovely, you should throw yourself into the well. A fresh and lovely person like you should be drowned. Don't you all agree?" Wendy, the maid who had served her since childhood, knelt and begged for mercy, as did others, fearing for their lives. If a close maid like Wendy could be sentenced to death by the princess just because of a word from the prince consort, what hope did they have? The princess, in a fit of rage, became even more furious upon hearing their pleas. I am the princess, she is just a lowly servant. No matter how long she has served me, a servant is always a servant. How dare she expect compassion? Drag her away. Throw her into the well. In a mad frenzy, she smashed the mirror held by the maidservants. Wendy fell to the ground in despair. Who could have thought that just moments ago, she was the trusted maid by the princess's side, so prominent and favored? Wendy died. When father woke up the next day, he was informed that Wendy's body had turned pale from soaking in the well. Father sighed inexplicably, "What a pity." This remark reached the princess's ears, driving her into another fit of rage. She smashed many things and scolded the slightly prettier maidservants, calling them vixens. The next day, a human skin lantern appeared in my mother's ancestral hall. The maid named Wendy used to be the princess's pawn to bully my mother, throwing things and spitting at her, and even insulting her outside the mansion, tarnishing her reputation. My father borrowed a knife to kill, settling this debt with Wendy. You see, those who do wrong must always repay. The servants in the princess's mansion were miserable, especially the slightly attractive maids. The princess was paranoid all day, and only when the maids were replaced with a bunch of unappealing, stout ones did her temper improve a bit. My father had hardly been home recently, he was constantly associating with the head eunuch of the Eastern Depot, searching and imprisoning officials guilty of corruption and bribery. The scent of blood on my father grew stronger and stronger. The princess hadn't seen my father for half a month and couldn't sit still upon learning that he had just raided a brothel, despite being heavily pregnant. She smashed the tea set and shouted like a shrew, "Bring Richard Wong back! Bring him back!" When my father returned, the bloodstains on him were not yet cleaned, and the blood drops at the corners of his eyes had coagulated, giving him an enchanting aura. The faint blood scent around him only made him more mesmerizing in such an environment than when he was clean. The princess threw herself into my father's arms, crying, "Richard, why don't you come back to see me? I can't sleep at night. I'm so scared. Do you have another woman outside?" My father intentionally wiped the unclean blood on his hands onto her face and chuckled, "Silly thoughts." Nowadays, my father had immense power in the court as the emperor's right-hand man, and even the princess couldn't shake him a bit. The princess sniffled and asked with a red nose, "Then where have you been all this time? Why haven't you come home? What are you busy with?" My father smiled alluringly and answered softly, "Busy killing people." The princess was stunned for a moment but quickly resumed an indifferent look, complaining disgustedly, "What kind of people require you to do it yourself? Aren't the jailers in the imperial prison good for anything? They dirty your hands." My father gazed at her eyes nonchalantly. "Doesn't the princess want to know who I killed?" She showed some interest. "Who?" My father's handsome face revealed rare genuine emotion and he smiled. "The wife of Censor Lee, the sister of Assistant Minister Wu, the new wife of Grand Tutor Wei, and the county lord." With each name my father mentioned, the smile on the princess's face faded a bit more. These people were all accomplices who helped the princess bully my mother back then. The princess's voice trembled. "Why did you kill them?" My father sighed. "Your father is getting old and increasingly indulges in beauty. These women all entered the palace to pay respects to the empress but ended up being favored by your father by mistake. 2 of them even carried royal offspring. I was doing the emperor's bidding, so I dare not ask why." My father leisurely watched her, a flicker of pleased excitement in his eyes. "Why is the princess shaking?" She took a deep breath, gradually calming down, and let out a sigh of relief as if surviving a great disaster. "So that's why." "I thought it was because." She stopped herself quickly, no longer continuing, and said in disgust, "Then they did deserve to die. Daring to climb into father's bed under mother's nose, dying 100 times wouldn't suffice. Just sullied your hands." My father's eyes were sarcastic. "Indeed, they did." As the year-end drew near, the princess was close to giving birth. A few days before her delivery, she repeatedly urged my father to put aside his work and stay home to be with her. She cried pitifully in my father's arms until he promised her, then she finally smiled. But on the day of her labor, she was in so much pain that she could not stand and nearly fainted, and my father did not come back. Not only did he not return, but the entire house was empty, without a single person to help. She curled up on the bedroom floor, moaning in agony, "Is anyone there? Hello?" The whole residence seemed deserted, no one came, only I remained. Her cries echoed around, and I closed my eyes, savoring the sound with unusual delight as I walked through the corridor. I pushed the door open, my face revealing terrified concern. "Your Highness, what's wrong?" When she saw me, she crawled over like she saw a lifeline, grabbing my feet and saying with great difficulty and sweat all over her head, "Quick, go get someone." I sobbed, "There's no one left in the residence. All those maids were recently replaced, and they have all run away." I couldn't stop them. I overheard them talking to a man. It seemed like that man had something to do with Wendy, but I couldn't hear clearly. "Even the guards have been reassigned. There was no man with Wendy, the people in the residence were assigned by my father. Childbirth is like crossing the gates of hell, the slightest mistake could mean the death of both mother and child. When my mother was giving birth to me, my father anxiously waited outside the door, even breaking the door in his impatience. Ignoring all taboos, he rushed in to stay by my mother's bedside, allowing the midwife and the doctor to scold him for half an hour without uttering a word, secretly wiping his tears. How could he not understand the difficulty women face during childbirth? He just wanted to make the princess suffer, to make her cry, to make her scream. The princess weakly pushed me, asking me to find my father. I tearfully said that my father had been attacked and his life was in danger. She almost fainted from shock. That night, she was in pain for 7 or 8 hours, by the end of which she was barely alive, as if she was about to die. I tenderly wiped her sweat, she couldn't die. When she was about to pass out, the doctor and midwife came in from another room, ushering in another round of screams. I sat outside the door, watching the sky gradually lighten, listening to the loud cries of the baby behind me, unable to help but smile silently. It was finally my turn. After waiting so long, enduring so much, it was finally my turn. I suppressed the spasmodic pleasure in my throat, resuming my usual behavior of being docile and timid. My father returned 15 days later. The princess, seeing the wounds and weariness on him, felt her grievances turned into concern. "Richard, I was nearly killed by that wretched maid, Wendy. How are your injuries?" My father said he was fine and, after hastily responding to the princess, went back to his room to rest. His injuries were real. He had just quelled an internal rebellion, the regent had attempted a coup. My father had allied with the imperial guards to suppress it. Although they won a decisive victory, he was injured. Yet I sensed an unusual vitality in my father, who usually seemed lifeless, like a walking corpse. It was only later that I understood where this rare liveliness came from. He had pacified the usurping regent, and now he held most of the military power within the court. Many court officials were his allies, cultivated over the past 5 years. My father was rejoicing because his painstaking plans were finally coming to fruition. A few days after recuperating, my father came to visit the princess. He deliberately sat by her bed, gently feeding her soup and telling her some amusing anecdotes to cheer her up. Just when the atmosphere was good, he covered his nose, frowned in disgust, and leaned back. "Why is there such a foul smell?" The princess' face turned deathly pale, then flushed red. She looked at my father dryly, instinctively hugging her blanket tighter. "Your injuries haven't healed yet, you should go rest early." My father ignored the sadness and reluctance in her words, nodded, said okay, and left. As soon as he stepped out, the princess's cries echoed from the room. My father's mouth twisted in a cold sneer, and he turned towards his study. My father knew too well how to hurt a woman, just as he knew how to love one. My mother once told me that my father cried particularly easily. When she was in confinement after childbirth, he would change her menstrual pads and cry quietly while washing them. At night, as he cleaned my mother's body, he would cry while helping her turn over, vowing never to let her have another child. Lamenting how he wouldn't have let her suffer had he known childbirth was so excruciating. My mother said he was like a child. But my father was far from childish. During my mother's confinement, he hardly slept, taking care of both me and her, cooking nutritious soups, and washing my cloth diapers. While my mother grew plumper during her recovery, my father looked as though he had been through hell but remained foolishly happy. He meticulously cared for my mother during her confinement, knowing all too well the details. He intentionally said those things to torment the princess. He knew the princess, of noble birth, and aimed to trample her dignity, driving her mad, making her suffer and feel ashamed. When my mother died, she was 2 months pregnant, the baby's gender unknown. The princess once threatened my mother, saying the child wouldn't live past 3 months. Yes, 3 months. 2 months later, the princess, who had just finished her confinement period, was back to her energetic and slightly annoying self. She sent invitations to all the notable officials in the capital city, throwing a grand banquet to celebrate her son being named the heir apparent. After my father suppressed the rebellion, he was granted the title of Lord by His Majesty. Now holding military power, my father truly holds sway over the entire country. The princess basks in the compliments and congratulations from the officials' wives. She aims to reclaim the congratulations and attention she missed out on her wedding day. The princess really has foresight. The top scholar has boundless prospects. No wonder the princess insisted on marrying him back then. She must have known that he would become a powerful figure in the future. The princess straightened her back, lifted her chin, and smiled proudly. After the imperial examination, the astronomer royal and the national preceptor both predicted that Richard Wang would become an influential official, remembered throughout history and revered by future generations. A man of such caliber is naturally suited to someone like me, not that lowly woman who didn't know her place. Besides, who in the entire capital is as handsome as my husband? In 100 years, my name will always be linked with his, and future generations will praise us as a perfect match of talent and beauty. The voices of agreement rose and fell around her. I hid behind a pillar, feeling a chill all over as I slumped to the ground. So, it was because of a prophecy that my mother was forced to her death and my father's request to resign was denied. Such an insubstantial prophecy had cost my mother her life, driven my father to madness, reducing him to neither man nor ghost. It was just a prophecy. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, it just seemed absurd. I wondered if my father would laugh or cry if he heard the princess's words just now. He'd probably go even crazier. Midway through the banquet, the cradle placed beside the princess suddenly broke, the basket tipped over. And the child fell to the ground, rolling down the steps, the surrounding screams rising and falling until the child rolled into the lake. One moment the princess was full of pride, and the next, she was in utter despair. Her anguished screams echoed through the skies as I stepped out from behind the pillar, watching her every expression change. I saw myself, from the time my mother died, overlap with her. Her pale, pained face was just like mine back then, her screaming cries were the same, even her stumbling, falling state mirrored mine perfectly. Whoever said there's no empathy in this world? Look, isn't she feeling what I felt? The pain of losing my mother, the pain of losing her child. She caused my mother's death on my birthday, so I took her child's life on her happiest day. It's been just under 3 months, a life for a life owed to my unborn sibling in my mother's belly. She needs to suffer the same pain as I did to count as repayment. Suddenly, I understood my father. What's the good in killing someone outright? For a person like the princess, who holds lives in contempt from her high position, it's better to let her live well. To slowly experience the pain she inflicts on others in her laughter and conversation, only then will she understand regret. The princess's mental state was poor. Ever since her child died, she hasn't been the same. She locked herself in her room, hugging a pillow and walking around barefoot. Only when she saw my father did she calm down. My father fed her, and she started crying while eating, apologizing to him. She said she wanted to borrow the fortune of the eldest princess's child, so she borrowed that cradle, not knowing it had already been eaten away by insects. My father comforted her, saying it was okay, children would come again. She cried her heart out, finally collapsing on her father's shoulder, sobbing, "Richard, the first time I saw you was when you became the top scorer in the imperial exams. You rode your horse through the streets, full of pride. My cousin, who placed second, invited you to a restaurant to celebrate, but you said you wanted to go back to make soup for your wife. You said your wife would be scared if she woke up from her nap and didn't see you." My cousin laughed when he told me this, but I remembered it in my heart. That night, I dreamt I was your wife, you making soup for me, putting me to bed, drawing eyebrows with me at the west window, gambling with books and spilling tea. I wished I could die in that dream and never wake up. My mother was the daughter of a high-ranking family, taught to be dignified and generous from a young age. After entering the palace, she became the empress. Under her knees, there was only me. She didn't know how to please my father like his concubines did. She was the mother of the country, told by everyone to be tolerant and generous, not to be jealous. So she watched as her husband spent nights with other women, only to cry in front of me, holding me and crying. I hated it, and I swore that I would find a husband who would cherish me, spoil me, and be mine alone forever. I didn't want to be a failure like my mother, who gave in at every turn. My father had many children, new ones every year. By the time I was 8, he couldn't remember my name. Living in the palace, my mother was like a bodhisattva, not knowing how to fight or be ruthless. She only knew how to wait. She didn't know that what she wanted had to be fought for. My father's love had to be fought for. Without fighting, there was no dignity of a princess. Siblings in the palace were enemies disguised as family, fighting only to protect their own interests, just to survive, to live the way a princess should. I know you resent me, but Richard, I truly admire you. My mother's love life was a mess. What could she teach me? Over the years, the palace struggles taught me only to grab. I set my eyes on you, and as a princess, you should be mine, shouldn't you? I drugged you just to make you obediently come to me. That Cheryl, she's not worthy of you. The royal astrologer said we are the perfect match. How could someone of her low status be a match for a talented scholar like you? She has no understanding of her own status. People like her don't last long in the palace or in the capital. Masters are masters, and those beneath them are not human. Their lives are less valuable than our cats and dogs. Richard, you were disobedient, too stubborn. You shouldn't have refused me. I am a princess, your master. Richard, don't hate me, please love me. Let's have another child. I'll give you a son. You don't need a concubine, I'm still young. I'm the most beautiful woman in the capital. None of them are prettier than me. She babbled incoherently, holding my father's face and muttering. My father's hand trembled uncontrollably, hidden in his sleeve. He was suppressing the urge to strangle her. It took all his effort to suppress the hatred boiling inside him. His eyes softened, a gentle smile on his lips. All right, we'll have another child. I won't take a concubine. How could I? No one is more beautiful than you. Under my father's careful care, the princess recovered significantly and was pregnant again 6 months later. This time, the princess was much more reclusive. She stayed indoors, often touching her belly in a daze. The imperial physician quietly told her father that the princess's mental state was unstable and couldn't be agitated any further. Any more agitation would lead to incurable madness. After sending off the physician, her father opened the study window and laughed mockingly. When the child was 6 months along, red lines covered the princess's belly overnight. She was terrified. This time, instead of being harsh, her father gently consoled her and gave her a box of ointment. Apply this, and the lines will disappear. Don't cry. He carefully comforted her, just to help her gather strength for the most devastating blow. He intended to destroy everything she cared about, just as she had done to him. The princess applied the ointment, and the lines on her belly faded. But soon, her once proud beauty started to rot bit by bit, slowly but lethally. The princess went mad. The thing she cared most about was her face. Meanwhile, my father gathered his forces and staged a coup. The princess locked herself in her room, seeing no one, unaware of what was happening outside. Unaware that her parents and siblings were imprisoned, unaware that my father's years of scheming were coming to fruition, unaware that she was about to die. Father returned to the mansion to see the princess again, but her face had completely rotted away. What was once an unparalleled beauty was now just decaying flesh full of pits and holes, with an eyeball hanging limply, a grotesque and terrifying sight. Father, however, was neither afraid nor concerned. On the contrary, he even started laughing appreciatively, and after a hearty laugh, he sat on the nearby chair to catch his breath. The princess, upon seeing the dragon robe father was wearing, immediately understood. She crawled on the ground to his feet, wanting to speak, but could only make a muffled sound. Father lightly lifted her chin with his foot and smiled. That drug not only makes your face rot, your tongue and liver will gradually decay too. It must be very painful, but you won't die from it. You'll have to wait slowly for death. You can't die too quickly, or I won't be happy. The princess cried, her appearance extremely terrifying, but father looked at her as if admiring a beautiful painting. When you held a knife and wanted to slice Cheryl's face, what did I tell you? I said that one day, I would ruin your face. You didn't believe me then, and even laughed, saying I wouldn't dare. You claimed that yours was the most beautiful face in the capital. Father's smile vanished, he lowered his leg and leaned in to look the princess in the eye. I've always found you disgusting. Whether it was back then or now, your face makes me feel repelled and sickened. How can you compare to my Cheryl? My Cheryl has a kind and pure heart and is much more beautiful than you. How dare you compare yourself to her? Father stood up, and the guards outside came in to drag the despairing princess away. Father was in a good mood. Don't worry, you won't die so quickly. Your parents must die before you. I will strip their skins off before your eyes. My skills are very good now, very smooth. When it's your turn, you'll know. The princess couldn't stop trembling. She always claimed her mother was generous and forgiving, yet for the princess's happiness, she tricked my mother into the palace and attempted to drown her. The emperor indulged her too, and after mom narrowly escaped death, he even rewarded her with poisoned wine. If father hadn't shattered the cup, stopped by the princess, both father and mother would have been long dead. Father looked at the beautiful day outside, overjoyed. He walked around the princess, clapping his hands with a crazed look in his eyes. You must die slowly, wait until I crown Cheryl as empress and she enters the ancestral temple. Only then can you die. I want all you hypocrites, these beastly men, to witness Cheryl's glory forever. Didn't you all look down on her? I want all of you to kneel before her. I want you so-called noble beings to crawl at Cheryl's feet and look up to her for life. Father glanced at her swollen belly and smirked. Every one of the children you're carrying isn't mine. The one who drank your medicine that day wasn't me, and I haven't touched you even once since then in this mansion. Didn't you pride yourself on nobility? How did you enjoy those beggars and death row convicts? The princess's frail body suddenly burst with great strength, but before she could reach father, she was subdued. She could only make hoarse, croaking sounds, unable to speak any actual words. She was imprisoned in the imperial prison. After the Ministry of Rights finished dealing with my mother's affairs, father came to settle the final score. When the princess saw her parents being skinned alive, she fainted but was quickly woken up by a splash of water. Now she couldn't move, no different from a living corpse, with rot completely festering inside her. Held down by 2 guards, she was filled with terror, wanting to flee but unable to move. The knife in father's hand cut through her flesh. Others died before being skinned, but not you. You must be alive to make a beautiful lantern. Your parents' lanterns already hang in Cheryl's shrine. There are 23 lanterns in the shrine now, just missing you. I saved you for last to ease Cheryl's soul. You must suffer. If you die too comfortably, Cheryl won't be at peace. The subtle sound of skin and flesh splitting echoed in the air, the stench of blood growing heavier. In the end, only a filthy pile of flesh remained on the ground. Father flicked the blood off his fingers, staggered a few steps, and laughed heartily. But as he laughed, he suddenly wept. Leaning on the railing, he retched, yet nothing came out, and he ended up vomiting a mouthful of blood. It turned out father found skinning disgusting too. That revenge didn't bring happiness in the end. Indeed, he had avenged, but the ones he cared about were long gone. How could he feel joy? The brightest lantern was hung in front of mother's memorial tablet. Overnight, father seemed to change into a different person. He poured all his energy into teaching me the ways of being a ruler. Father spent 4 years clearing out the remnants of the former emperor's faction and corrupt officials in the court, then enthroned me as empress. He knelt before me as on that day, placing his hands on my shoulders. You must be a good empress, so that your mother can remain in the ancestral temple forever, receiving their worship and incense, understand? Yes, I replied. He tried to stroke my head as he did when I was small but ended up lowering his hand. I have wronged you. I don't seek your forgiveness. I haven't been a good father, I only cared for your mother in this life and neglected you. In the next life, I will repay you even if I become a beast of burden. I wanted to tell him, Father, I love you and Mother. I've never blamed you. But I couldn't say it. For many years after, I kept wondering why I didn't say those words that day. Why? Father returned to our old residence and settled in the ancestral hall where Mother is honored. He hardly ever saw me. When I went to see him, he rarely met me. Until one day, he started coughing up blood uncontrollably and fainted in the manor. Only then did I find out he had been taking a deadly concoction daily. I rode on horseback to see him and found him collapsed on the floor of the ancestral hall. His robe was open, and his entire body was flushed with heat. He was clutching Mother's memorial tablet, lying on the floor, and carefully kissing the name engraved on it. The royal physician said he didn't have many days left to live. He waved at me, appearing still somewhat dazed, and asked, "Do you know Cheryl?" A bitter feeling rose in my heart. He continued speaking, muttering to himself, lost in a mix of mania, tears, and laughter. She saved me. I was copying books for Mr. Wang's son, and I made an error that broke a taboo. Mr. Wang's son and his servant beat me, but Cheryl stopped them and bandaged my wounds with her handkerchief. When I asked her who she was, she said she was a singer in Mr. Wang's household and hoped that a gentleman like me wouldn't despise her handkerchief. He murmured, his eyes unfocused, "What kind of person was Cheryl?" I don't know. I only know she saved me, and I wanted to return her handkerchief. When I saw her again, she was covered in wounds, about to hang herself. She had been sold to a brothel by her parents. She's someone even more unfortunate than I am. She saved me once, I wanted to save her once. She gave me all her savings to buy her freedom. If I got her out, she would be mine. The document said I could buy and sell her, but how could I ever sell her? She had nowhere to go and had to stay with me. We treated each other with respect. She didn't let me copy books anymore. She gave me all her remaining savings and asked if I could become a top scholar. She said she would be fine even as a concubine or servant girl. She asked anxiously, but all I thought was, what concubine, what servant girl? Cheryl supported me through the exams, cooked and cleaned for me, and even gave birth to our daughter. Naturally, I wanted her to be my wife, my legitimate wife, my only wife. She was my wife when I was at my lowest. How could I ever mistreat her? How could I ever take a concubine? Father had never told me these stories from the past. I only remember when I was 5, a princess took a fancy to Father and asked him, "Have you never despised Cheryl for being a prostitute?" Father was furious and, overwhelmed by the princess's persistence, retorted with harsh words. Despise? Why would I despise the woman who married me at my lowest, who saved my life? Chastity means nothing. It shouldn't even exist. It's nonsense. Cheryl had no choice, it's the world's fault, not hers. What did she do wrong? Her only crime was being a woman, sold into a brothel by her parents for 10 copper coins. Cheryl's heart is purer than any of yours, purer than all the hypocrites in this world. Cheryl's chastity, in her mind, was never within the prejudice of the world's eyes. I love Cheryl. No matter what, I love her. I pity her, I could never despise her. I despise you. I came back to the present and watched as Father suddenly crawled up from the ground. He pushed me away and staggered forward, grabbing a pair of scissors from the table and slashing his face with all his might. Blood splattered everywhere, but he seemed unaware of the pain, murmuring with certainty, "It's this face's fault, all this face's fault." I was terrified, my hands and feet ice cold. I rushed to grab him, but he hugged Mother's memorial tablet and started crying in the corner. Blood and tears mixed as he sobbed uncontrollably, gasping for breath. "Sherry, I'm disfigured. What if, in the afterlife, Cheryl doesn't like me anymore?" What if Cheryl doesn't like me anymore? A young eunuch supported me and asked what to do. I suppressed the bitterness in my eyes. How should I know what to do? The third princess is dead, and with that, father's last breath of determination also faded. He was supported by hate all this time. Now that the hate is gone, how can he continue? He seemed calm, but he had long been mad. He endured it for so many years until he could endure no more. How many times did his heart collapse? I could never know the collapse in his heart. Get a royal physician, quickly. I tried not to cry, approaching father and grabbing his hand. Father, you're hurt. Let me help you get bandaged, okay? He tilted his head to look at me. After a long time, he suddenly smiled. It's Sherry. He held my hand, his dark eyes shining brightly, filled with an innocence not befitting his age. He smiled happily. Sherry, your mother went out to buy groceries. She'll be back soon. Let's pick lotus flowers for your mother. She loves lotus flowers. Come on, Sherry, let's pick lotus flowers. He pulled me outside, and I broke down, crying. Heaven, I beg you. If there really is another life, please let Richard and Cheryl be safe and sound together for life. Take my life in exchange. Take my life for it. Let me die early. Let me die a horrible death. Let any mishap befall me. I'm willing. Just let them be happy in their next life. Even if I must die now, I'd accept it gladly. Father died one afternoon. He died outside Mother's ancestral hall, as if he didn't dare go in. Father feared his disfigurement would make him unworthy of meeting Mother and worried he had too much blood on his hands, afraid it would taint her. He was so foolish, Mother would never blame him. I buried them together. On the way back, a newly recruited young eunuch asked me, Your Majesty, what are the characters of your name? I was taken aback and replied word by word, Sherry Wong.